Hello, everyone, and today I'd like to talk about a new book that I bought recently. It's by James Nestor. It's called The Breath, and I'm doing like a breathing series right now. So I talk about Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McCowan. I think this is a very nice book as well. And so I began reading it, and again, this book talks about the proper way of breathing as well. And it shares a lot of similarities to Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McCowan. So James Nestor begins by saying that he suffered from having a small mouth, his tongue not fitting in, he choked, he had V-shaped dental arches, and of course congested airways and even sleep apnea. So snoring, sleep apnea, choking, what have you. He had a lot of issues, and that has partially also had to do with the diet that he was consuming. And this actually caused bacteria to, or at least can cause bacteria to flourish because our nose filters the air, right? Our nose does all the filtration. Yet 40% of the population have nasal congestion, 25% have choking and other things like sleep apnea, but 80% of sleep apnea is underdiagnosed. So there's a lot of problems. These conditions are so common nowadays. In fact, as I'll talk about later, on his way to the gym, he was meeting a lot of other people on the streets, and all of them had nasal congestion issues. And so it's a problem, it's a common problem. Now, he begins by talking about an experiment that he did at Stanford University where he literally plugged his nose with silicone plugs and surgical tape. So he was not able to breathe with his nose, he only breathed with his mouth. And the experiment was done for 10 days, and there was another participant from Sweden, Anders Olsson, who also did that experiment, this 10-day experiment with him. And they were tested before and after for things like pulmonary function, inflammatory markers, stress hormones, etc. And so the interesting thing is that he mentioned in his book about oxygen is that we actually began taking oxygen 2.5 billion years ago, and that's what led to the evolution of mammals that we know today. And simply because oxygen is so much more energetic than CO2, and that's why he talks in the book about why aerobic exercise is so much more efficient than anaerobic. It's literally 16 times more efficient because that's how much more energy we can generate with it. And before that, so 4 billion years ago, let's go back a bit more, the fuel was carbon dioxide when we first appeared on rocks, but that changed after around 2.5 billion years ago mark, when we began to use oxygen. And that, of course, gave us so much more energy to do all of our vital functions like catch prey, escape predators, and even adapt to our environment. And so before the experiment began, the author went to Philadelphia to see Mariana Evans, a woman that x-rayed skulls from the Morton collection, where there were skulls literally up to 200,000 years old. And these skulls had big skulls, which is twice as big as we have right now, huge nasal apertures where air comes in, broad dental arches and mouths, and straight teeth. So they didn't have a single crooked tooth. But because of our breathing now, our jaws are positioned back, our faces are flat, we have crooked teeth, and we have narrowed, congested nasal sinuses. And since evolution, we learned to do things like soften and tenderize meat and use fire to better process the food, and that led to us having larger brains, which is great, but that has to come in the expense of something, and that came into the expense of our morphology. So our front of our face is flattened, our sinuses got narrower, right, and our airways got tighter and more congested, and our mouths got smaller, and we even evolved the protruding nose. And we adapted somewhat to temperature and sunlight amount by adjusting our morphology. Our larynx went lower so we can communicate, and our lips were thin and which made talking easier. And our tongue became more flexible, which also made talking easier, helped us vocalize more sounds. But that again came with an expense because a low larynx increased the space in the back of the mouth, which posed a higher choking risk. So all of those things based on our evolution actually made breathing a bit more difficult than our ancestors, like the Homo habilis and the people who were there before us. So that's the problem. It made that a bit more challenging, and it also increased the risk of choking because of our larynx moving lower down. Now, one day after the experiment, the author actually measured himself after only breathing through the mouth, and his snoring increased by 1,300%, and sleep apnea events increased fourfold. And he felt terrible. In fact, he hated life, and his blood pressure went up by 13 points, which was enough to be considered as type 1 or stage 1 hypertensive, and his stress level went so much up, and HRV went down, and so he wasn't resilient to stress at all. Mental clarity and cognition also fell down, plummeted, and he just felt miserable. And also he did an experiment where he actually biked with his friend at a gym, and he got fatigued so fast. And Douillard, I think that's how you say his name, Douillard, I think, showed that subjects who pedaled, in fact these experiments were done even before, while nose breathing had lower breathing rate, were able to maintain their heart rate and pedaled at an intensity of 10 times higher before getting tired. And many scientists were actually experimenting before with mouth breathing. And in 1970s and 80s, Harvard actually did an experiment with rhesus monkeys and showed that mouth breathing over a period of approximately 6 months caused them to get the same features as modern humans that Marianne Evans actually did. And she had a client, Gigi, which I'll talk about later, or at least that's the way the author names her in the book, had similar effects. So these rhesus monkeys had similar effects to modern humans, like long faces, small mouths, V-shaped arches, and slacky jaws, and a tightened airway that made breathing much more challenging. And this is exactly what happened to the author too, as he began mouth breathing in the experiment. He got headaches, blood pressure, as I mentioned, went up by 14 points. His sleep was terrible, and his airways became very constricted, which made breathing much more difficult. And he also wanted to urinate more, which caused him to wake up frequently during the night. So his sleep was definitely becoming worse. And in children, it was also mouth breathing was also shown to cause ADHD, depression, and high blood pressure as well. And Japanese studies actually showed this because of less oxygen in the prefrontal cortex, and literally a smaller amount of neuronal or brain cells, which of course led to this ADHD and also decreased cognition and mental function. And as I mentioned, Gigi, which is one of Marianne Evans' clients who analyzed these skulls from the museum, actually showed that returning back to nasal breathing restored her, was able to restore the clients, and not only this one client, Gigi, but all of her clients, broad faces. They're able to get back their forward jaws and wider airways and nasal apertures, and even reduce their blood pressure, depression, and headaches, which is exactly the features that Gigi experienced before when she was mouth breathing, and that the author experienced right now of the other participant, Olsson, in the study. And again, rhesus monkeys too became rhesus monkeys again in the Harvard experiment, when finally after 2 years they were able to open their noses again and breathe through their nose. So literally mouth breathing changes our facial morphology, and that's kind of what I wanted to address here. Not only it makes breathing more difficult, but it actually changes our morphology and how we look like. It literally gives us slacky jaws, flat faces which are not broad at all, small mouths which our tongue can't fit in, crooked teeth, and most importantly, which actually is because of the changes in the mouth, congested airways as well. And so it makes breathing much more difficult. And you can see all of these things, because of the changes in facial morphology, make breathing more difficult and can elevate stress levels, make sleep more difficult, and even raise blood pressure, which of course can give rise to chronic disease. So you can see the negative effects of nasal breathing can even lend themselves to the structural level, and that of course changes our physiology to a great extent and makes breathing so much more challenging. And that's why I strongly recommend changing to nasal breathing in order to make breathing a lot easier for whatever you do when you exercise or just at rest, and to reduce stress level, improve mental function, reduce blood pressure, and enhance cognitive function.